Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first in was intended to be a webinar series. Will hopefully still be a webinar series of the Energy Research Centre in the Ryan Institute at NUI Galway. This is, as I said, this is our first talk. We are very excited to welcome our speaker, who I won't introduce just yet. First of all, I just want to say a little bit about what the Energy Research Centre is. We're the group of researchers focused on sustainable energy transition here at NUI Galway. We're a group of scientists, engineers, social scientists from across the university, and we decided that over lockdown we were sort of missing each other, so we would try and get something where we could at least engage with each other in some meaningful way. And so the upshot of this was this wonderful idea from Roberto Gonzalez here, who's a postdoc in the School of Chemistry and also a Ryan Institute researcher. He came up with this idea and pitched it to us, and we thought it was fantastic that we would use this as a forum to introduce the work of some of our PIs as well as some distinguished visitors to NUI Galway. The intention was that we would broadcast this simultaneously online and have the in-person talk as well. We all know what's happened to the online systems here at NUI Galway in the last 2 weeks. So we're having an in-person seminar. I keep wanting to say webinar, but an in-person seminar. It's being recorded, and so we can catch up on this conversation later. I'd like to introduce my colleague in the Energy Research Centre, Dr. Frances Fahy, and Frances is in the School of Geography, and she is going to give a brief introduction on what her work is in the Ryan Institute, and then is going to introduce us to our speaker. So thank you very much.
Great.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Hopefully that's okay. Thanks so much, guys, for being here today. It's an absolute honour to have with us Professor Jennie Stephens. I had the great privilege and pleasure of meeting Jennie back in 2014. I was on a Fulbright in Massachusetts at the time, and Jennie kindly gave me some of her time. We chatted about sustainability, and since then we've been involved in collaborating on a number of different conferences. Most recently, Professor Stephens and I arranged or hosted the SCORI International Conference, which is on sustainable consumption, and that was back in the middle of the pandemic in June of last year. So today, why I'm particularly honoured and delighted that Professor Stephens accepted our invitation is, as Rory said, this is the first of our series. But Jennie's research interests really span such a range of our own research clusters here within the Ryan Institute. So as well as the Energy Research Centre, I'm involved in the Social and Economic Impact Research Cluster, and there we have geographers, all sorts of social scientists, and people who are interested in the humanities, and we're interested in obviously a range of environmental issues. And really, when I think about Jennie's work, and she's very kindly offered to give us a range of her interests today. She, at the current time, is the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University in Boston, where she's also the Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy. And I'm really delighted to see so many of you here from the Environmental Leadership class, because in her work and in her new book, which she's going to refer to today, Jennie argues that the climate crisis is a crisis of leadership. And she argues that politics, all politics is now climate politics. So if we think about all of our policies, from health to housing, we have to consider and include climate resilience as well as renewable energy. So I think, and I know so many of you, particularly from the environmental leadership cohort, will and hope will take away some really interesting insights from today's talk. So her new book, which we're very delighted that you're presenting on, Professor Stephens, really examines climate and energy leadership in relation to a range of different sectors: economic justice, health, housing and transportation. And if you read at the moment, there are so many glowing reviews of this book, which was released last year, 2020, and the kind of words that come up again and again in all those reviews are insightful, thoughtful, inspiring, but very importantly offering hope for so many of us working in this field. A really distinctive aspect of Jennie's work is that really kind of diversity and inclusion are rarely discussed when we think about energy and climate studies. And in her work, Jennie really captures the voice of those that are traditionally marginalised from these conversations. So without any further ado, I will stop introducing her work and let her speak for herself. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, Professor Stephens, and thank you for joining us.
Great. Okay, is it? Great. So thank you all for being here. I was realizing that this is actually the first time I've given an in-person talk about my book, because it came out in September 2020. So I gave lots of book talks, but they were all virtual. So thank you, and it's great to be here. And what I've done for the talk today is connect my standard talk that I've given about the book with some of my recent research that isn't integrated into the book. This book is, I'm at a unique time in my career where I have the flexibility and freedom to actually write this book, which is a non-academic. It's more of an engaged, publicly accessible book. So it's great today to have an opportunity to talk about the book and then also connect with ongoing and new emerging research initiatives as well. So I guess I'll start with just introducing myself, a little bit more background. I was actually born here in Ireland. I was born in Dublin, and I have dual EU-US citizenship. My family moved to the Boston area when I was 8, and I was always interested in environmental science and policy, and did an undergraduate degree, one of the first that was really an integration of science and policy. Did a very technical PhD and master's in environmental science and engineering, and then came back to the Boston area, Cambridge, to do, because I knew when I finished my PhD, I wanted to get more involved in bigger picture social and political aspects rather than the technical. I had my first faculty position at Clark University, which is an hour outside of Boston, where I really was able to build an interdisciplinary portfolio on climate and energy and the social and technical dimensions. I was a faculty member at the University of Vermont, which is a few hours north of Boston, for a few years, and I'm currently at Northeastern University in Boston, which is a very interdisciplinary kind of applied university, really pushing innovative approaches for academics to have an impact. So it's a good place for me to be and to have worked on this book. So what I want to do is actually connect. We think about climate and energy often in very technical terms, and most of the faculty and mentors and experts that I've engaged in throughout my career have kind of a sense of kind of a technical perspective, and we don't often connect climate and energy with the economic injustices of our society. And so I like to start with this to just show the widening income and wealth gaps. This data is from the United States pre-pandemic. I really should update it. It's on the front of the New York Times today that the widening gap is, the gap is even wider post-pandemic. And we don't always think of this as related to climate and energy, but it really is. In large part, because the top 1%, the people who are making money right now with the current system, really don't want the system to change. Some have been using this term, polluter elite, about those, to refer to all those who are really profiting from fossil fuel interests and perpetuating the current systems and really investing for decades to resist the transformation that we all are studying and advancing. So this, they've been doing that through a misinformation campaign to deny climate science, also undermining public trust in government and like the premises of democracy, and also minimizing worker protections and worker rights. So there's really been a cultural shift in companies to focus on shareholders and not on workers, and really just trying to minimize how much companies have to pay for workers. So this undermines public good, public policy, public interest, because there's such powerful concentration of wealth and power among those who don't want the transformations that many of us are working toward. So I propose that the climate crisis is a crisis in leadership, in part because of the way we have been framing the climate crisis. I use this phrase, climate isolationism, which is this very technocratic lens of thinking about climate change as something separate from everything else, something that we focus on greenhouse gas emission reductions and decarbonization in a very technocratic way, basing it on like models that we can, and assumptions about how we might be able to control things and change things. And we've really been missing opportunities for connecting the climate crisis with improving the human condition. And so an alternative perspective a framework within which I view the energy transformations that are needed is this idea of energy democracy, which is really acknowledging that the climate crisis creates an opportunity for us to invest in people and communities in new, innovative ways. And you can base those investments on social justice and human dignity, and leverage the urgency for transformation that comes from the climate crisis to make investments that may have nothing to do with climate and decarbonization, right? There are so many reasons why we want to transition away from fossil fuels toward a renewable-based future, and the reason that it's revolutionary is because renewable energy, every single community in the world has access to renewable resources, whether it be wind and solar, whether places near the water or near the ocean also have wave and tidal potential, offshore wind potential. Inland communities have geothermal energy, which we've underinvested in massively. And all of those renewable resources, unlike fossil fuels, are perpetual, abundant, reliable, and free. The resources themselves are free. Obviously, we need to invest to be able to leverage those resources, but they're there to be used. And we just haven't been making the investments that are needed to distribute the power, literally and figuratively, right, in a renewable future. So chapter 1 of my book connects those ideas with thinking about leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I'm obviously here are some images of political leaders, but I'm not only talking about political leaders. I'm talking about leadership that we all can see ourselves as leaders in our communities, in our families, in our organizations. Chapter 1 is called Growing the Squad. And the squad are these 4 junior congresswomen that came into power in the United States 2.5 years ago, and they drastically changed climate policy in the United States. And their form of leadership is based on collaboration and inclusion and participation. And specifically connecting every single policy with the fundamental premise of distributing wealth and power rather than concentrating wealth and power, prioritizing investments in communities and workers' rights, and reducing inequities and disparities by centering economic justice, racial justice, climate justice, and leveraging transformation by linking problems together rather than keeping them siloed and separate. And so obviously the opposite or the antithesis of this kind of leadership is conventional patriarchal leadership, which is very much based on intentionally excluding people, dominating competition among, and with a goal of actually concentrating wealth and power to those who already have wealth and power, and prioritizing investments to maximize corporate profits, exacerbating inequities and racial and gender disparities. And the only way to sustain that kind of power is to actually deny the problems and to say there's no problem with climate crisis, there's no problem with even the pandemic, there's no problem with a housing crisis or economic injustice. Everything's okay. And so this denial is very strategic to sustain the status quo. And I think we all have to recognize that, but it's important to actually say it. And one other thing about this phrase, anti-racist feminist leadership, one of the things in my own experience, and it's really an invitation for everyone to think about these words, what we don't want, what we know is that women, people of color, people who are from other marginalized groups in different societies around the world, when those people are given opportunities to participate, lead, be involved in decision making, we come up with different ideas because we have different life experiences, different priorities, different perspectives, and there is research on risk perception that shows people have different perceptions of risk. So there's something called the white male effect, and there's published literature on this showing that in the United States at least, white men think that everything from AIDS to climate change to smoking to getting hit by a car is less risky than women think, or people who are not white. So there is something there that speaks to why diversity is so important, that actually is based on people's different life experiences, different ways of assessing the problems and thinking about approaches to confront the problems. So the book goes into, it's actually a lot of anecdotal, inspirational descriptions of creative, innovative leaders. And I'm not going to go through all the leaders because you can read the book if you're interested. And I also want to leave time for questions. We have an hour, so I'd love to have time for a discussion. Since we are here in person, it's a great opportunity. But I do just want to highlight a few of the examples of specific leaders that I highlight in the book. Jackie Patterson was the director at the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and she and her team came up with this fossil-fueled foolery, an illustrated primer on the top 10 manipulation tactics of the fossil fuel industry, and particularly how in the United States they have manipulated black communities in particular. And this kind of revealing this disparities and inequities and very intentional strategic oppression is just so powerful and really impressive and impactful work. Other leaders, Maura Healey is the Attorney General in Massachusetts, the state I live, and she's using legal tools to sue the fossil fuel industry on terms of greenwashing and false claims in their advertising and things like that. Here, what I've done here is connect, I also in this chapter talk about solar geoengineering, which is a whole other topic, but it's a topic that a cohort, a very small group of scientists, mostly men from global north, universities. Harvard has the biggest solar geoengineering research program, have been promoting this idea that the climate crisis is getting so bad that we should be studying injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to cool the Earth by blocking incoming solar radiation. There are indigenous communities around the world that are, and others, who are resisting this advance in calls for more research on solar geoengineering. And so I mentioned that as one of the approaches. It's connected to the polluter elite because the biggest funders of solar geoengineering research is actually Bill Gates and other billionaire techie kind of people who think about climate and think, oh, what's a technical fix? So it's kind of the ultimate technical fix, and it's something that I think is really dangerous, and I have actually gotten involved recently in multiple publications talking about how dangerous and risky it is to continue to advocate for doing more and more research on this. So if you're interested in that topic, it's kind of a side because it was mentioned in the book, but it's coming up more and more, and we actually just got this paper accepted. It'll probably come out in the next few days on the dangers of mainstreaming solar geoengineering, a critique of the National Academy's report. The United States National Academy of Science and Engineering just came out with a full report calling for a United States publicly funded solar geoengineering research program, and colleagues and I got together and wrote a pretty strong critique of this report because they talk about the need for international, not unilateral programs, and they talk about stakeholder participation as central, yet they themselves don't incorporate those principles in what they came up with. So this is kind of an aside topic. It's an area that I don't do research in. I actually don't want to get research funding in this because I'm advocating that we shouldn't be spending research on this, but it's something that, again, in the position where I'm in right now, and given my background, I've gotten involved in kind of this resistance, I guess, to this approach to climate. So there's a lot of interesting things we could talk about with that. But I want to come back to other leaders that are really connecting climate and energy with jobs and economic justice. So there's a whole chapter on different leaders who are doing that, and one of the leaders is one member of the squad, AOC, you may have heard of, who really, in collaboration with the Youth Sunrise Movement, came up with the Green New Deal proposal that has really expanded, and it's a shift in climate policy, because climate policy before has been very much focused on economic, market-based mechanisms, and this is radically different because it's about investing in people and communities and what people need, and then connecting those investments to a renewable future. So there are other leaders that are also working on connecting workforce training and workforce development in renewable futures. We know there's a lot of opportunities for new and different kinds of jobs. It's really important who gets those jobs, and especially when we think about the economic justice implications. But there's a whole chapter in the book about jobs and economic justice and leaders that are doing really innovative work, kind of resisting this economic precarity that we've all kind of gotten accustomed to, really reclaiming the power of public investment and massive, big public investments to help things accelerate transformation, and then restructuring society for a more inclusive prosperity so we move away from the concentration of wealth and power that we've seen. So here I just wanted to mention a new paper that was just published in Energy Research and Social Science that my students, actually this started as a class project in my class last fall, where the students compared different Green New Deal proposals, including the EU I think it's called the Green Deal, and at different jurisdictions, there's actually, there's the national proposal for national Green New Deal, but there's also many cities and states and indigenous groups have come up with a Green New Deal-like set of proposals. So what we did was just characterize and compare these different policies and how they're emerging in different contexts and different jurisdictions, which is very timely and topical because this is the future of climate policy. So let's see here. The next chapter in the book is about leaders who connect climate and energy with health and well-being and food. Robert Bullard is often considered the grandfather of, or the father of, environmental justice. Gina McCarthy is currently in the White House National Climate Advisor, and she's been advocating for a long time that the way to get traction on climate is to connect it with health, and that many communities and jurisdictions around the world have started to claim the climate crisis is a health emergency, right? So that has been quite a lot of traction there. And I mentioned Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, in this chapter because she also demonstrates this kind of leadership, and we saw this in the beginning of the pandemic, where she brought the science and the evidence and strict measures, and then she used a very compassionate and empathetic way to explain to people that the reason we need these strict measures is not just for your own health, but for your family's health, the community health, and the health of the nation. And so she represents kind of, again, this different kind of leadership that is able to connect health in a more holistic way to some of the climate and energy initiatives. There's a chapter on transportation, some leaders who are connecting climate and energy with transportation issues, particularly transit justice. A lot of the conventional climate and energy transportation work is about electric vehicles, right? And we know that electric vehicles are only accessible to very few people. They're not, and they're not really transformative in terms of changing the way our assumptions with mobility and how we, different options for alternative ways of moving ourselves around. And so there are some leaders, including Ayanna Pressley, who's the congresswoman who represents me in Massachusetts, and she's also a member of the squad. And she has really been a leader in equity and transit justice issues at the national level. Michelle Wu is a Boston City councilor who is currently running for mayor of Boston. They actually have the elections the first week of November. She could be the next mayor of Boston, and she has come up with the most comprehensive Green New Deal for the city of Boston. And so if she gets elected, I think there are going to be some big changes in Boston, and also some really innovative things. One of the things she's been proposing is free transportation, public transit, making the subway and the buses free because it creates all kinds of economic mobility opportunities, which obviously is controversial, and people say, well, how are you going to pay for it? And it's just rethinking some of these assumptions that we have. In this chapter, I also mentioned Greta in terms of a leader who demonstrated in her, obviously she's had an impact on climate and energy in lots of different ways, but when she came over to North America for the climate talks, she came by sailboat, right, both directions, and used that act as a way of resistance to fossil fuel use and air travel. The final substantive chapter of the book is about housing, and it connects the opportunities and innovative leaders in climate and energy who are focusing on housing and housing justice. Representative Ilhan Omar, another member of the squad representing Minnesota, has been a leader in calling for big national level investments in housing. There isn't a whole lot of traction for that. Housing insecurity I know in Ireland as well, and in the United States is a growing problem, and there aren't a whole lot of strong proposals on what to do about it, and it's gotten worse again during the pandemic. But there's obviously so many opportunities because housing and our built infrastructure is such a critical part of the energy transformation. So if we were doing big public investments in housing, it's really a big opportunity to transform our energy, household energy. There's also, I talk about in this chapter, an example of a group called Moms for Housing in Oakland, California, and this is actually an organization that was founded by 4 mothers who were housing insecure. They didn't have a place to live, and they moved into a vacant house that was owned by a developer, and they lived there for a few weeks, and then the authorities came to evict them in the middle of the night with a full military-style eviction, and they used that experience to call for housing as a human right. Like they have nowhere to go, and there are a lot of empty housing in Oakland, and that is an example of, we don't necessarily think of them as climate and energy activists, but by advocating for housing as a human right and advocating for investments in public housing, there are connections there for sure. And the last example is a group of women in Canada, the tiny house warriors, who have been resisting fossil fuel pipeline development across Canada with building tiny houses, and then they're on wheels and they can actually move them to block the construction, and they are building on their cultural association with the land as their home, and they've been, so it's a different kind of activism and leadership in terms of resisting fossil fuel infrastructure. So what I wanted to do in the last little bit, and then we can open it up for some discussion, is talk about a chapter in the book that I didn't include in the book. I wanted to actually, was about education and leaders and leadership in education that connects climate and energy with transformations in how our educational systems work. The editor for my book, I had a great editor in Island Press that helped me with the book, and I told her I want to have another chapter on education, and she said, no, that's like too far off, it's not consistent with the other chapters, and so there isn't a chapter in my book about education, but because my own career is in education, and I think a lot about the role of higher education in particular in advancing and accelerating transformation in society. This is actually an area that I'm really interested in, and I'm part of my sabbatical next year, where I'm going to be based here in Ireland, is going to be actually studying and exploring and thinking about innovations in education. So I got first inspired by this by Jasmine Banks, who was one of the people I interviewed for the book. She's the executive director of an organization called Uncoke My Campus, which is about the Coke network and the fossil fuel polluter elite in the United States that have been strategically investing and supporting energy institutes around the country to promote fossil fuel interests and resist transformation to renewables. She and I actually wrote a paper together about ending fossil fuel reliance and how that's connected to racial justice, but my interactions with her also have encouraged me to think more deeply about the role of education. We actually think of education and our educational systems as a positive. Like, we don't think that we're actually reinforcing the status quo, but there are ways that we definitely are. And it's not just with the research, but even how we teach and what we teach, what's included in the curriculum, what's not included in the curriculum, how we organize our campuses and innovations. The campus can be a microcosm for innovation, and then how we interact with communities and our local communities, broader communities, and we're part of, in colleges and universities are part of lots of different kinds of communities. So I have some interest here, and at Northeastern University, the university where I'm at, I was part of a faculty senate group that passed a resolution about climate justice action within the university. You don't want to read all of this because it's like very, but the point being here, what we've decided and what we're pushing for as a faculty is that the university think about climate action. Many universities have a climate action plan, and what we advocate is you need more than a climate action plan. You actually need a climate justice action plan, and the distinction there is to broaden the discussion. So it's not just about greenhouse gas emission reductions and decarbonization, which technically most universities could do if they have the funding and the resources, but thinking about deeper, about these social connections, and recognizing that many of our anchor institutions are actually contributing to the status quo and reinforcing some aspects of society that are resisting the transformation. So that's a piece of that. And I'm also part of an organization, a network called the Climate Social Science Network that I recommend people to look up, and it's an open network of social scientists who are interested in climate, and particularly the group seems to have a focus particularly on kind of resistance to climate policy and trying to research and understand why and who is funding and supporting resistance to transitions and transformation. And so I'm on the working group on higher education, and we have a paper in the works called About the Fossil Fuel Industry's Influence in Academia, and Noel Healy is a member of that group, and he spent time, he got his PhD here, right?
He is graduate geography, yeah.
Yeah, so he sent his regards. I collaborate with him. I talk to him quite frequently. He sent his regards to Galway, and he's done some interesting work also about divestment and the divestment movement in universities. And I'm also working with other students on thinking about how can colleges and universities promote the energy transition and more broadly a societal transformation toward a more equitable future. So I think I'll end here. The last chapter of the book really talks about, okay, so what can we all do? How can we feel engaged and involved? And as I mentioned, when I talk about leadership, we all can be leaders and we can act to inspire other leaders. I think we really need to be thinking about systems change and not just individual or incremental changes. And we can be all kind of understanding and unlearning racism and sexism and these other structural forces that are marginalizing people and leading to underinvestment in what we actually need. There's also obviously opportunities for all of us to engage with innovations in local distributed community renewable energy, and I know there's interest among some of you here in that area. And obviously as academics and those of us in the kind of the research space, we can leverage data, science, and research and information to justify and support the changes that are needed. We can also support cooperatives and novel economic structures, and that's where I think we've been, as a society-wide, we tend to focus on technical innovation, right? But we don't invest as much in social innovation. And we know that the technical innovation on its own, without paying attention to how it's going to be adopted and implemented and the social changes associated with, things get stuck in I think they call it the valley of death, right? Between R&D and deployment. So there's a lot we can be doing here. I end with Mary Robinson, obviously international leader in climate justice, and she has said, some of these ideas may seem radical, especially this feminist perspective, but on the other hand, it's just a people's first approach. So if you put people first, what do people need? How can we prioritize investment so that we're getting what people need? Then this doesn't seem so radical at all. And also mention Shirley Chisholm, who's the first black woman to run for president in the United States in 1972, which obviously is a long time ago. I think, in some ways, if you think way back that far, I think many people at that time may have thought or hoped that we would be farther along in our both racial and gender dynamics in politics than we are right now. But there's lots of inspiration from the legacy of previous leaders. So I will end there and just mention that if you are interested in buying the book, all the author proceeds for the book go to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And I'd love to thank all of the, I don't have an acknowledgement slide, but all of the students and collaborators that I work with on multiple parts of this project, or multiple different research projects, and obviously the book itself was an independent project, but I also thank you to have this opportunity to talk about it with all of you, and I look forward to questions, and thank you to Francis and Rory for inviting me.
So much, Jennie. So many different thoughts and topics there. Really, really insightful. So thank you. I know Dr. Kinderman and I could probably talk to you for hours about the last, what we're doing in universities. I mean, we think we've made great strides in so many areas when it comes to divestment, but there's so much more, and we'd love to pick your brain on that at another stage. But does anybody have any questions for Professor Stephens? And she's happy to talk about the book. She's happy to talk about any of the aspects of the research that she's currently working on. So it's a great opportunity to have her here face to face. Go ahead, Jennie.
Okay, thanks very much. Very interesting, inspiring talk, and really energetic. And it's really exciting to see all the work that you've done. And one thing that just struck me there was that there's a lot about politics, and policy. And I was kind of wondering, how do we manage, and it's kind of a very broad comment, more kind of the need to be elected and the short term. You talked about a mayor in Boston, so I don't know how long a mayor is, but here it's 2 years, is it? But how do you, the need for long-term planning, how do you juxtapose that with the need for to be re-elected or short-term leadership positions where you can do something? Yeah. Doing like the metro thing would take a long time, but it's not going to be in the lifespan of a leader, a political leader. So that's kind of always challenging, I think. Yeah,
great question. And I mean, I think there's no easy answer, right? When we're talking about transformation, big shifts in society, we know that generally that happens slowly. But we also know, and we saw it with the pandemic, things can actually change very fast if the conditions are right? If there's reason for the changes and the emergency kind of situation. So I think, there are obviously elected officials, or a leader in any role, only has like a window of opportunity, right? That's in the policy space we talk about, and try to leverage that time that they do have to catalyze and build the groundwork for, and obviously there's only so much they can do, and there's so many things out of anyone's control that will influence what actually can get done. So I think it's all about having this vision of a different world is possible, right? It is possible for us to be working toward, it's a long journey, it's not an instant change, a more sustainable future, a more equitable future, economic justice where we don't have this continual perpetuation of the concentration of wealth and power. I mean, it's not good for anybody. It's actually not even good for the billionaires. They think it's good for them, but so it's about changing some of even the narratives and frames that we use, that we assume is normal or typical, and in terms of actual change, it's impossible to predict or project how and how fast things will go. It all depends on so many factors. But I think it's about being true to a longer term vision, and then leaders doing what they can in the time they have. And then inspiring others to take it on, so that even if that leader steps down or is not elected, there's a movement and there's a larger. So even if an opposition leader comes in and pulls things back for a bit, all the literature on how big societal transformations happen in transition theory, it's not a linear thing. And it can go up and down, backwards, and sometimes it might seem like we're going backwards, definitely. But sometimes you might need to go backwards to step forward too. So like it's a different way of kind of thinking about it. But that's how I would respond. Yeah.
Could I maybe? It's a kind of a follow-on question to that one. So you said that these transitions can take a long time, and I completely appreciate that. And but if the climate crisis requires very fast action, how should we balance off the idea of fast incremental action versus slow transformational action? Like when the clock is ticking, how do we trade those two off?
Yeah, so I think again, it's almost a reframing that it's not a trade-off. It's actually both and, right? Like the argument, and part of the argument I make in the book, is that we will not be able to make the large transformational changes that are needed until and unless we integrate all of these ideas and systems and policies, right? Because if we just focus on climate as a separate thing, then health and housing and, it'll continue to be only some politicians, some people's priority, but not everybody's, right? Because most people don't wake up, more and more people do wake up every day stressed out about climate, but it's not what most people are worried about: housing and food and education for their kids and healthcare. So I think that doesn't get to the speed question, but I think that's one part of it, is that we need to be working toward larger transformations. Of course, you still need small steps to get to that systems change. So it's not to say that incremental changes and small steps shouldn't be celebrated, aren't essential to build the movement and build the momentum for bigger changes. But so it's not to diminish small steps at all, and it is. Again, and systems change can actually happen quicker than we might suspect, right? Because it's not linear, as I said. It's not like a gradual, we've done this much, this is how fast renewable installations have gone so far. We don't just assume that's going to keep going the same rate, right? Like if something could happen and it could just go skyrocket and fossil fuels could plummet, right? Like we're seeing the uncertainty and all the different dynamics. So it's not a linear, systems change is never going to be linear, and it's also unpredictable, the timing. So I think we have to be somewhat comfortable with some of that ambiguousness, but yeah, I think that's how I'd respond to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
How would you recommend we take this conversation to those that are ideologically opposite? Because sometimes you speak about like feminism to someone and then we like close their mind. No, you're talking about like it doesn't make sense to mix feminism with climate, or it doesn't make sense to mix this and that.
Yeah.
Yeah, seeing through a wider view is better, but some people just don't see it that way, so how would you recommend to take the conversation to them?
Yeah, great question. And one of the things I acknowledge is, particularly the last chapter of the book, is that we're in an increasingly divided society, right? And especially politically, and maybe it's not quite as bad here in Ireland as in the United States, but I know there's people are kind of getting more adamant in what they believe and think. So maybe less easy to see each other's perspective. And I think that's what you're getting to. And I think, there are various approaches, and there's no easy answer to that. I think the idea of focusing on what people's first approach, like what do people need, what do families need, what do children need, what do is one approach, and I think you're right that sometimes, like, anti-racist feminists, a lot of people will be like, whoa, I don't know what, that's not something I associate with, it's not something that I'm comfortable talking about. So I think you also have the opportunity to choose different frames and language, talking to different kinds of people. And I think, I guess for my audience for this book was really people who I think are worried about climate and energy and haven't really thought about it in terms of this anti-racist feminist perspective. So I think that's why I felt comfortable putting that in the title of my book, because I'm not really going to try to convince people who aren't intrigued or interested or self-identify as curious about anti-racist feminist perspectives. And so I think I'm very aware of that. But I do think listening and learning, I mean, many of us have people in our families, in our communities, in our organizations, different people who have, very different priorities and perspectives. And I think finding common ground about what people do care about and is an opportunity, but listening and learning across the divide is time consuming, it can be very frustrating, it can be really hard, and sometimes people can't deal with it. And in the United States, it's also gotten quite antagonistic and violent and mean, and I've gotten hate mail and negative, things said about me, and so have the squad. They've got, even worse. They've gotten like death threats and really bad. So you also can't let the opposition take over and change what you want if you can safely speak up and speak out about what you believe and how you want to frame these issues. It's an opportunity to mobilize and catalyze some people's motivation, I think. But then obviously you're, as I said, you're also probably putting some people even farther away, right? They're like, so it's a balance. And I think we all, in our different kinds of interactions, different kinds of venues, different audiences that we're talking to or interacting with, can adapt and be aware of different perspectives. But I think that's part of why I'm comfortable using those words, because also what that means, what it represents to me, is that kind of openness to try to understand different people's perspectives and not be narrow in a particular. It's an invitation, as I sometimes say, we don't only want women to be the only ones talking about gender equity. We need everybody to talk about gender equity. We don't only want people of color to be talking about racism and anti-racist. We need everybody to acknowledge, we know the facts and the structural issues. It shouldn't only be the people who are marginalized who bring up the issues. And so that's part of why, again, I try to encourage white men to think of themselves as anti-racist feminist leaders, right? Why not? But it's not always comfortable, right? So it's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennie.
I've seen just on the communication thing, we had Catherine Hayhoe was here just at the beginning of lockdown last year. I think it was the last talk she gave before everything just shut down. Yeah. But she was talking about how she uses her kind of deep Christian faith to form bonds with people that would traditionally be on the other side of the kind of ideological divide. And she she doesn't really talk about, you know, climate, because she's a climate scientist, but she talks more about like values that most people would have, kind of the same basic values, and so she tries to make a convincing argument from, I think, exactly what you said, but through the lens of her faith. So I thought that was a really interesting angle that she took.
Yeah, she's really impressive and very impactful in this realm of bridging the divide, especially about climate, because it has been very politicized and divisive. Yeah.
She still gets a lot of hate now, though.
Yes, yeah.
You addressed one of my questions, which was, I read so many positive reviews of the book, obviously all over the place, so clearly you have received the other side of that, in the sense of that feedback. And has the squad been issued with a copy of the book?
I did, yeah. I sent them all a signed copy. The only one that I've met and know, well, I don't really know, is Ayanna Presley, who's local to Massachusetts. So yeah.
Okay. Any final questions, Angelica? Yeah.
Many thanks for the talk. It has been really, really interesting. I was wondering about how you explain that the polluter elite are trying to resist the transition. And I've been working a little bit on France, and I found out that there, the incumbents are sometimes sort of buying out the transition processes, in the sense that you have, for example, a local community building up a transition process, and then the process is opposed by the national incumbent, sort of retakes the whole transition processes by putting its own renewables. So it's transition, but it's absolutely not diversification, and it's not anti-systemic. And I was wondering if you had witnessed the same dynamics in the US from these the powers in place.
Yes, absolutely. The network in the United States, what some people have called the octopus, it's like a octopus, like all kinds of ways that they have been investing at local levels, including even there's a network that comes up with local policies to resist renewable energy, and then all the local communities and state level as well all adopt the same policy to make it harder to have renewable energy, right? So they're very well coordinated, very sophisticated. People don't know what's going on. They think someone knocks on their door and they have a proposal, and it makes sense, because why would you spend money on something that doesn't work? You know, and they gain traction, and it's deep cultural kind of takeover or manipulation. You know, when I lived in central Massachusetts, outside of Boston, the house we lived in, we put solar panels, and we got incentives for it. And a neighbor walked by and looked up and said, "Oh, you have solar panels. I thought those things didn't work." And I was like, "No, they work. You know, it can work." But again, there's a deep kind of. It's not just strategic communication, but it's strategic policy networks at very local levels. So it sounds similar to this kind of co-opting the transition and then kind of buying it out. And as you said, it gets away from the systemic changes, but kind of appeases the intention of moving toward renewables, right? And we see that also with fossil fuel companies that say they're going to diversify and invest in renewables, where they might only have a tiny section that does that, and their main business is still very much sustaining fossil fuel interest. And how to get fossil fuel interest to leave it in the ground is the biggest challenge I think that we face. And the powers are so deep and tentacled right throughout that it's hard. We did do research on categorizing energy kind of policies it was a framework on energy democracy policies. And what we found, there's this resist, reclaim, and restructure framework within energy democracy. And most of the policies are about reclaiming and restructuring, pro-renewables. There's very few policies about anti-fossil fuel, like resisting the powers that be, right? It's a lot harder work. So that's why the leaders that I showcase in the book who are actually standing up and resisting the fossil fuel interest, it's hard. You have to be brave and courageous and be ready for all kinds of negative, it's not mainstream. And those of us even in our own, sounds like here there was successful divestment movement.
Within the university,
within the university, but in my university, they're not interested. They don't want. We have a ExxonMobil executive on our board of advisors for the university. So we're not going to divest from fossil fuels probably. Although Harvard just did and Boston University just did. They didn't say divestment, but they said that we're going fossil fuel free. And so, it's hard to resist those powerful interests. And that's that's the challenge, one of the challenges ahead of us, yeah. But thank you for that question. I'd love to talk more about it too.
We might take one final question if that's
yeah.
okay. Jennie, yes.
Thanks, Frances. I just had a question slightly related to that about the topic of leadership. Because I was thinking, and it's not a fully formed question, but do people, like within these kind of siloed topics, do they struggle to define themselves as leaders? Do you know, like I was thinking of the women in housing, like are they directly relating to the climate crisis? Or is that, is that a connection you're making?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think many activists do think of themselves as leaders, but they also don't think of themselves as having a lot of power necessarily. They're trying to exert power, right? So they're not elected officials, they're not CEOs of companies. And that's part of why I did focus on leadership, because I think we need to broaden our view of who is a leader, right? And that's kind of, again, an invitation. We can all think of ourselves as leaders in certain ways, right? It doesn't mean we're elected officials or we're CEOs of companies, but we all, from our own standpoint in our own lives, have agency. We have opportunities to influence others and demonstrate leadership. And so I think that's one of the points of focusing on leadership, is to broaden our sense of what that is and to really think that everybody can be empowered to be a leader in the right, and part of it is even how we talk about it and how we talk about people's work and their contributions to society, whatever they may be, as actually acts of leadership. So a very important question that you raised. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, Jennie. For everyone interested in the book, the NUIG library, once the system is up and running, will definitely be ordering several copies. So I just on behalf of us all, thank you so much for your visit.
Thank you. Thank you.